Hiya. This lesson is going to talk about the difference between a strong and a weak acid. Before we do that, here are 5 questions, retrieval questions. What does concentration mean? Number 2, which ion is present in an acid? Number 3, what colour is an acid with a pH of 1 in universal indicator? Number 4, what colour is an acid with a pH of 6 in universal indicator? And number 5, how is an acid of pH 1 different to an acid of pH 6? So pause the video and go ahead. Okay, let's have a look. Number 1, what does concentration mean? Concentration simply measures how much of a substance is actually present. If a lot of the substance is present, then it's highly concentrated. If not much, then it's dilute. Number 2, which ion is present in an acid? So obviously, I hope you got this, H+. What colour is an acid with a pH of 1 in universal indicator? Red. And number 4, what colour is an acid with a pH of 6 in universal indicator? Yellow. And how is an acid of pH 1 different to an acid of pH 6? Well, pH 1 is going to be a strong acid, and that's like hydrochloric acid, and pH 6 is going to be a weak acid, like ethanoic acid. That's vinegar. Moving on. So understand the difference between a strong and a weak acid. And there are 2 learning outcomes. Explain the terms dilute, concentrated, weak and strong in relation to acids, and describe neutrality and relative acidity in terms of the effects on hydrogen ion concentration and the numerical value of pH. So let's have a look at this. Would you drink acid? Why do you think this? Think about this one. You can pause the video here and have a little brief discussion. Okay, let's move on then. What is the difference between concentration and strength in relation to acids? Once again, pause the video here and have a think about this one. Now then, let's have a look at this. So, I'll go through this. The strength of an acid is a measure of how ionized it is. A strong acid will be fully ionized. So for instance, hydrochloric acid fully ionizes, whereas a weak acid, like ethanoic acid, partially ionizes. So that's the strength. The concentration of an acid is a measure of the number of moles of acid in 1 litre. Now don't forget, 1 litre is 1,000 centimetre cube. So for example, 2 moles per litre of hydrochloric acid is twice as concentrated as 1 mole of hydrochloric acid or 1 mole of ethanoic acid. So that should give you an understanding of the difference between strength and concentration. The pH of a solution is related to the concentration of hydrogen ions. So that's what the pH of a solution measures. The higher the concentration of hydrogen ions, the lower the pH. Don't forget, don't think because the pH is lower that the acid is weak. Low pH means strong acid. pH 1 is strong acid. pH 6 is weak acid. At the same concentration of an acid, the concentration of hydrogen ions will be higher in a strong acid than in a weak acid. So pH 1 will have a higher concentration of hydrogen ions than pH 6. This is why pH of a strong acid, like hydrochloric acid, will be lower than the pH of a weak acid, like ethanoic acid. Now you may want to pause the video here and summarize this in your own words. Do not copy, but summarize. Okay, let's move on then. So, strong acids fully ionize. There's the example. Hydrochloric acid fully ionizes into H plus ions and Cl minus ions. Nitric acid fully ionizes. And sulfuric acid fully ionizes. Whereas weak acids do not fully ionize. Instead, they form an equilibrium. For example, here, look at this funny arrow. That's a reversible arrow. At the same concentration, strong acids have a lower pH than weak acids. If we move on, here's an example. Hydrochloric acid, pH, ethanoic acid. And once again, the reason is because ethanoic acid has a lower concentration of H plus ions than hydrochloric acid. And hydrochloric acid fully ionizes, whereas ethanoic acid partially ionizes. Concentration is the same, but look at the difference. When you react them with magnesium, that produces lots of hydrogen gas, whereas that produces some hydrogen gas. And the reason is because the hydrochloric acid is a stronger acid than ethanoic acid. Hydrochloric acid has a high concentration of H plus ions, whereas ethanoic acid has a low concentration of H plus ions. If we move on. Here are 5 questions for you to attempt. Pause the video here. Number 1, explain why HCl has a lower pH compared to ethanoic acid. Number 2, why did HCl react more violently? Number 3, how do you know what gas produces? How do you know that the gas produces hydrogen? You should know the hydrogen test. Number 4, what test could you do to prove the gas is hydrogen? And number 5, why is a pH meter better to use than a universal indicator? Now, questions 1, 2, and 3, and possibly 4, I have talked about, or your teacher should have talked about. Number 5, I will go through it. Pause the video here, and then have a go at these 5. Okay. What you should find, number 5, it's a typical question, typical possibly 2-mark question, and the answer they're looking for is the pH meter is much more accurate and it's a lot faster. Okay, just in case you're wondering about the hydrogen test, it's normally worth 2 marks, and what you have to say is you test it with a burning splint. That'll get you 1 mark, and the second mark is a squeaky pop. That gets you 2nd mark. If we move on. Why is it okay to eat ethanoic acid and not sulfuric acid? So again, you can pause the video here and you should know the answer to this one. By the way, ethanoic acid is vinegar you put on your food. So we do eat that. Okay. Let's try some exam questions. The pH scale is a measure of acidity or alkalinity of a solution. Draw 1 line from each to the pH value of the solution. Let's see how you did. So acid, pH 5, neutral, pH 7. Moving on. Which ion in aqueous solution causes acidity? 1 mark. Okay, so H plus ion. As a matter of interest, that one is the alkaline ion. Moving on. When sulfuric acid is added to sodium hydroxide, a reaction occurs to produce two products. So there's your sulfuric acid, there's your sodium hydroxide, there are your two products. How many elements are there in the formula H2SO4? Not atoms, it's in how many elements are there. I'm going to correct this. If it said how many atoms, then you would say 7. But because it's saying how many elements, there are 3 elements. The element hydrogen, the element sulfur, and the element oxygen. But if it did say how many atoms, then the answer 7 would have been correct. Moving on. What is this type of reaction? So this type of reaction, acid with an alkali, which produces salt and water. What type of reaction is it? Okay, let's have a look. It's a neutralization reaction. 1 mark. Describe how an indicator can be used to show when all the sodium hydroxide has reacted with sulfuric acid. The salt was sodium sulfate, and there. Check your answer with that. This is key. When it turns green, there's no more acid, no more alkali left. Moving on. And that's the end of this screencast.